The picture that still wakes me up at night isn't in any folder on my computer. It lives in the back of my mind, fixed like a frame from a film that never finishes. A narrow slice of canyon sky is visible through cracked, dust-coated glass, the light outside too bright to belong to a place that quiet. Dry air presses against my lungs, carrying that faint smell of metal and old stone, and every sound seems swallowed before it can cross the room. There's a scrap of fabric on the floor, frayed sun-bleached, the kind of woven strap you only notice when it's not where it should be. In the corner, a metal pipe runs along a crumbling wall, cool to the touch, vibrating just enough that you can feel your own pulse in it. Somewhere far off, a door slams, the echo traveling through concrete and hollow space like a warning. I remember the grit under my shoes, the way dust lifted in the beam of a flashlight and hung there almost still. And in the center of it all, where the light and shadow met, there was the unmistakable outline of something that should have been on my sister's shoulder, not on that floor. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from, and follow if you believe some names should never fade. Back when all of this was still in front of us, my life was painfully ordinary, in the way you don't appreciate until it's gone. I worked days in a windowless office in Riverside, tapping at a keyboard while the air conditioner hummed and the smell of burnt coffee drifted down the hallway. My evenings were a rotation of laundry grocery runs and phone calls with my younger sister Lily, who liked to tease me that I lived like a retiree at 36. On those calls, I could hear her world through the line, the hiss of milk steaming in the cafe, the jingle of the door when someone walked in, the low murmur of conversations under the ceiling fans. Flagstaff air always sounded lighter somehow, like the altitude thinned out the noise along with the oxygen. I didn't know it then, but those casual, half-distracted chats were the last time my days would feel safely predictable, like pages in a calendar you assume you'll keep turning. Lily had a way of making even the most ordinary Thursday feel like the opening shot of a travel film. She'd send me pictures from her walk to work, pine shadows on the sidewalk, train tracks glinting in the early light frost on the windshield, and winter thunderheads in late summer, piling over the San Francisco peaks. You could almost smell the resin from the trees and the diesel from the passing freight trains in her photos. She worked mornings at a little coffee shop off Route 66, a brick building with green trim and a hand-painted sign that always looked slightly crooked in her shots. When she'd call on her break, I could hear the clink of ceramic mugs and the soft thud of the tamp as she packed espresso, and she'd talk about light like other people talked about the weather. "The canyon is different every hour," she told me once, her voice low and excited steam hissing in the background. "It's like the whole place is breathing." I was the older, steadier one. My life smelled like printer ink and leftover microwaved pasta. On hot evenings, I'd sit on my small apartment balcony listening to traffic hum along the freeway and the distant yip of neighborhood dogs, scrolling through Lily's latest shots on my phone. She was chasing something beyond wedding gigs and senior portraits. She wanted to be in the kind of magazines you saw at airport newsstands, the ones with big landscapes on the cover that made people sigh in waiting rooms. When the rejection emails started coming, the polite formulaic, not the right fit messages, she'd forward them with a little eye roll emoji, then send me another photo, stubborn as ever. I could hear wind in some of her voice messages, that dry, high desert wind that makes flags snap against their poles and carries the faint smell of dust and sun-baked rock. That summer, July 2014, the heat pressed down over northern Arizona like a thick, invisible hand. Even from California, I could feel it in Lily's voice when she called that lazy drag in the afternoons when the sidewalks shimmered and cicadas screamed in the pines. She told me business at the coffee shop picked up early and died off by noon as tourists retreated to their motels, staying in cool air until it was safe to stand near the sidewalk again. In Flagstaff, the smell of rain could appear out of nowhere, those monsoon clouds building over the peaks in the late afternoon, throwing purple shadows over town before dropping sudden sheets of water and then moving on. Lily would step outside between customers, letting the damp air hit her skin, watching the drops darken the sidewalk always with that camera strap hanging from her shoulder. It's funny what your memory hangs on to. I can still see the way that strap's woven pattern contrasted with the smooth worn cotton of her t-shirts. The day she first met him, she called me on her lunch break breathless in that way she got when her brain was running faster than her words. I was at my desk in Riverside, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the smell of someone's reheated onions lingering from the break room. "Lore, he actually came in," she said, the clatter of cups somewhere behind her. He sat right at the counter like a regular. She didn't say his name yet, just the Canyon guy, like he was a character out of one of her trail books. Through the phone, I could hear a low male voice ordering coffee, the scrape of a chair on the old wooden floor, the soft jingle of the door as someone else came or went. She lowered her voice, the microphone brushing against fabric. He brought a map. The real kind. Creases, dirt, everything. Not an app. Over the next few days, I learned more about him in fragments, like overhearing bits of conversation through a hallway. His name was Cole Mercer. He was 30, a few years younger than me, with a suntan that didn't come from weekend hikes and a permanent squint from years of staring into glare off sandstone. He'd worked on trail crews and search and rescue teams, and people in town said he knew the canyon like other men knew their own neighborhoods. Lily described the sound of his voice as low and steady, the kind of voice that didn't rush to fill silences. She said his hands looked permanently rough, the skin browned and creased, a thin white scar running across one knuckle like someone had slipped once with a rope or a blade. "He doesn't talk much," she said one evening, the buzz of the cafe's neon sign faint behind her. "But when he talks about the canyon, it's like he's remembering someone he loved and lost." I remember rolling my chair back from my desk, the vinyl squeaking in the quiet of my office. I stared at the spreadsheets on my screen while she told me how she'd laid her photo book out on the counter, the pages catching the morning light from the front windows. The way she described it, dust motes floated in that beam like tiny, slow-moving constellations over her work. Cole flipped through without saying much, his fingertips leaving faint smudges along the edges of glossy paper. She told me she watched his eyes instead of his mouth, the slight widening when he hit a shot taken at dusk, the way the lines around his eyes deepened when he lingered over a frame that turned the canyon walls almost violet. I could hear the espresso machine hiss and sputter as Mark worked in the background, the low burble of conversation rising and falling. "He said he'd take me," she finally whispered, as if saying it too loud might make it untrue. "Not on a tourist route. A real backcountry line. 3 days. Wolf Creek." I'd grown up near those rocks. Even after years in California, the words backcountry line and July in the same sentence made the back of my neck tighten. The desert heat had its own sound, a kind of high, constant whine in your ears when you'd been out in it too long. I asked the questions big sisters ask. Did he have a permit? Was she going with a group? Had she checked his references with someone other than the guys at the coffee counter? Lily laughed softly through the receiver, and I could almost see her brushing hair back from her face, the soft scrape of her bracelet sliding down her wrist. She told me everyone in town knew Cole, that rangers trusted him, that he'd patched trails and found lost tourists and guided documentary crews. "He's not stupid," she said. "He's the one who tells other people not to be stupid." Flagstaff in July has a strange rhythm, busy mornings, slow afternoons, and evenings when townspeople come out like they've been holding their breath all day. On the night before their planned departure, I sat at my kitchen table sorting bills while the box fan in the window blew hot air around the room. Outside, I could hear kids riding skateboards down the sidewalk, the hard clack of wheels against uneven concrete, and the low hum of traffic heading toward the freeway. Lily texted me a photo of her backpack laid out on her bedroom floor, neatly rolled clothes camera bodies wrapped in soft cloth lenses, lined up like soldiers, a small notebook on top of everything. She'd captioned it with a string of exclamation points and one short sentence, 3 days, big sis. I wrote back something practical about sunscreen and water, then added a heart. I remember noticing the soft yellow light on her bedroom walls in the picture, the way it made the canvas of her pack look almost golden. The morning they went to the park office for permits, she called me from just outside the building. I could hear the echo of footsteps on concrete behind her and the faint roar of a tour bus idling nearby. The air on her end of the line sounded thinner, like it does when you're standing at elevation in dry heat. She told me how Ranger Alan Ruiz had frowned at their route, his eyes squinting against the sun as he looked from their paperwork to Cole's calm face. He told us there's no water for miles and that radios cut out in those canyons, she said. I could almost smell the sun-warmed asphalt and sunscreen from the bus tourists as she talked. She told me how Alan stamped the permit anyway, the hollow thud of the stamp hitting paper echoing in the small office, and how his parting words followed them out the door. Stay on the main trail. Check in every night. Don't get clever. Later that day, back in Riverside, the office air felt especially stale. I'd propped a small fan on my desk, and it pushed warm air past the stack of claims I was supposed to be reviewing. My phone buzzed with another picture from Lily. A dusty trailhead sign, sky washed out to a near white in the midday sun, and a glimpse of a blue SUV parked on packed dirt. I zoomed in without thinking, noticing how the gravel around the tires was light, almost the color of bone, and how the shadows underneath the vehicle looked sharper than they did in California. She followed it with a quick voice message, wind rushing across the microphone, her breath a little fast. Cole's voice faint in the background doing a last gear check. "We're heading out," she said, a smile audible in those 3 simple words. "Talk soon." That evening, while they were hiking into the canyon, I tried to picture exactly where her feet were falling. I imagined the crunch of sand and gravel under her boots, the smell of hot stone and sun-baked sage, the rasp of cicadas along the sparse trees clinging to the upper rim. I remembered my own teenage hikes down those switchbacks, how the air seemed to change from pine-scented to mineral and dust in just a few hundred feet. In my apartment, the air was thick with the faint scent of dish soap from the sink and the savory smell of my neighbor's cooking drifting through the wall. I stood at my window watching the orange smear of sunset behind power lines and tried to match it to the colors she would be seeing, deeper reds, older shadows, that canyon light she was always chasing. I went to bed later than usual that night, the box fan rattling in the dark, its blades chopping warm air into softer currents that brushed against my skin. My phone was on the nightstand screen. Dark, a faint smudge of my fingerprint on the glass catching the glow from the alarm clock. I told myself she'd check in after they made camp once her hands weren't full of gear and tripods, once the light had slipped behind the rim and the rocks had cooled enough to sit on. The room around me smelled faintly of laundry detergent and dust. The hum of the refrigerator in the next room, a steady background note. I lay there listening to the distant whoosh of cars on the freeway, waiting for the small, familiar buzz in my hand that meant Lily had made it to wherever she was going. The phone stayed quiet, and for the first time in a long time, the silence in that little dark bedroom felt just a shade heavier than it should have. I remember the moment the air shifted, though nothing dramatic happened at first. It was just a small pause in my day, the kind you don't think about until years later, when you replay it like a scene you missed the first time. I was standing in my kitchen in Riverside, rinsing out a coffee mug, sunlight falling through the blinds in thin, dusty stripes. My phone buzzed once, the soft vibration skittering across the counter, and when I wiped my hands to check it, there was nothing. No message. No missed call. Just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the warmth of the ceramic mug still in my palms. I set it down and told myself it was nothing. Phones glitch, signals drop, people forget to press send. But under all that ordinary logic came a feeling I didn't know how to name, yet a kind of hollowness in the air, like something had been removed from the room without making a sound. The next time I looked at the clock, it was nearly 8 in the evening. I stepped onto my balcony with my phone in hand, letting the warm night air press against my skin. Cars whispered down the street below their headlights, gliding along the asphalt. The neighbor's wind chimes tapped softly in the slight breeze. Still no message. No picture. No quick voice note filled with wind noise and excitement. I refreshed my screen twice, then 3 times, that quiet unease spreading slowly like a cold spot in a warm room. I told myself she was probably photographing sunset, the canyon turning gold and violet. I pictured her kneeling somewhere on a ridge while Cole stood behind her, patient as ever. I made myself believe that image because it felt safer than the silence I couldn't explain. By the time I went inside, the sky had turned a deep navy, and the cicadas outside my window had settled into that rhythmic, vibrating chorus they saved for heavy summer nights. I kept my phone close, touching it with the back of my hand every few minutes, as if the warmth of the glass could tell me she was safe. When I finally went to bed, the sheets smelled faintly of detergent and sun from drying on the line earlier that day. I lay there listening to the fan chop the air and waited for that familiar buzz. It never came. Morning brought a sharper kind of worry. The sunlight seemed too bright for how little sleep I'd gotten, and the room looked out of place, the same furniture but wrong somehow, as if the shadows were falling differently. I checked my phone before I even sat up. Nothing. No timestamp from the early morning hours, no second attempt at contact, no quick reassurance. I pushed aside the fear by telling myself their campsite was probably tucked into some corner of the canyon where signals bounced off the walls or disappeared entirely. That was common. She'd told me that herself. But common things aren't comforting when your gut is already tightening. I called her anyway. The ringtone echoed through my small bedroom flat, and distant, the kind of electronic chime that could never convince you a human hand was behind it. When it rolled to voicemail, her cheerful recording played that light little laugh at the end, and hearing it made my heart skip in a way that wasn't pleasant. I hung up and called again. Same result. I tried to distract myself by going through the motions of a normal Saturday, sweeping the floor, folding laundry, making a pot of coffee, even though I barely tasted it. But the air felt heavy in my apartment, as if the temperature had jumped without warning. Around mid-morning, I stepped outside just to breathe something other than recycled air. The neighbor across the landing nodded at me while watering a row of potted succulents, the hose making a soft hiss against the clay pots. She asked if everything was all right. I must have looked off, and I said something vague, something about being tired. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't true either. By noon, the worry had settled in fully, not loud, but firm, like the feeling of standing on uneven ground. I left 2 more messages for Lily, my voice too bright, too rehearsed. I kept telling her to check in when you can, as if pretending nothing was wrong could make it true. A little after 1, I called the coffee shop in Flagstaff. Mark picked up the clatter of cups and voices behind him, telling me he was busy. He hadn't heard from her. He sounded concerned, but not alarmed. "It's the canyon," he said gently. "Signals disappear out there. She's fine." His tone was soothing, but through the phone I could hear him wiping his hands on a towel, the quick, brisk strokes of someone trying to stay composed. I told myself to wait until evening. Give her that much. Give Cole that much. They were probably resting somewhere with the tent pitched the heat off their backs, their boots unlaced in the dust. But every hour felt longer than the one before it. The sun crawled across the sky, leaving a bright glare on the living room floor, and the air in the apartment grew warmer as afternoon light poured through the windows. Around 3, I picked up the phone again and called Ranger Ruiz's office. A part of me felt foolish, like a child calling the school to ask if a field trip bus was late, but I needed to hear from someone who knew that canyon better than either of us. When Alan answered, his voice was steady, the low, measured tone of a man accustomed to emergencies. I explained everything, or tried to, my words coming out too fast at first, then slowing. He listened without interrupting the faint hum of a desk fan audible behind him. When I finished, there was a brief silence. Then he asked what time she'd promised to check in. I told him. He didn't lecture me about delays or unreachable pockets of wilderness. He didn't reassure me outright. He just said he would look into it and asked me to stay reachable. His calm was meant to settle me, but it only made the room feel smaller. An hour later, he called back. The wind was loud on his end, rushing against the microphone. He told me they'd found Cole's car in the Wolf Creek lot, exactly where it should have been parked neatly between two faded white lines. The door had been locked, nothing inside disturbed. Just a thin layer of dust on the windshield already settling in the July heat. He said that wasn't unusual. Plenty of hikers left their cars for days on backcountry permits, but he wanted to let me know he'd checked. The sound of that wind kept carrying through the phone, pushing a small chill through me, even though it was 90 degrees outside. After I hung up, I stood with my hands braced on the kitchen counter, feeling the cool laminate under my palms. I stared at the microwave clock, its green numbers bright in the dimming light. The neighborhood outside had quieted. Even the children who usually played near the cul-de-sac were gone, their laughter replaced by the soft rustle of palm fronds outside my window. I kept telling myself that everything was still within the bounds of normal. People lost track of time. Batteries died. Guides changed their pace based on weather. But beneath those rational explanations, something colder began to root itself. Not panic, but a creeping recognition that a line had been crossed. Near dusk, when the sky over the freeway turned the color of peach and embers, Ranger Ruiz called again. This time, his voice sounded different. Not panicked, not alarmed, just clipped, controlled. He said 2 rangers were hiking toward the area where Lily and Cole had planned to camp that first night. They expected to reach it before full dark. He told me he'd call when they had eyes on the site whether or not they found anything. He asked if I had someone with me. I lied and said yes. After the call, I stepped outside again. The air was cooler now, carrying the faint smell of sprinklers from the lawns down the street. A single moth fluttered around the porch light, tapping against the bulb in uneven beats. I watched it fly in frantic circles, beating its wings against glass as if trying to outrun its own reflection. That soft tapping sound mixed with the far-off hum of the freeway, and I realized I was holding my breath. I tried to sit on the couch and wait like a reasonable person, but every sound felt amplified, the tick of the wall clock, the creak of the apartment settling the soft thud of a neighbor closing their door. When my phone buzzed again, the vibration skittered across the coffee table like something alive. It wasn't Lily. It wasn't anyone I knew. It was the caller ID for Coconino County. The last light of the day had faded from the windows. My apartment was washed in blue-gray shadows, the kind that make every room feel a little unfamiliar. I answered, my voice sharper than I meant. On the other end was a man who introduced himself as a deputy. He cleared his throat quietly before speaking, and I could hear the background noise, a radio crackling, someone murmuring instructions, a door opening and closing. He said they'd like to ask me a few questions when I had a moment, and then he told me as politely as he could that someone from the county was on their way to my address. Hearing that spoken so gently in the dim quiet of my living room was the moment my knees weakened. I looked out the window, seeing my own reflection in the glass, and waited for headlights to turn onto my street. The sky outside was a deep, sinking blue. No stars yet. Just that heavy, waiting dark that settles right before everything begins to change. The deputies showed up just after sunset, their cruiser easing into the complex without sirens, only the muted flash of amber lights reflecting off the parked cars. I remember the low rumble of the engine settling into silence and the way the warm night air thickened with the smell of hot asphalt as 2 officers stepped out. One of them paused at the bottom of the stairs, adjusting his hat in a slow, deliberate gesture, like he was preparing himself for a conversation he wished he didn't have to start. Their radios crackled softly. Stray bits of chatter carried up toward my balcony, sharp against the hush of the neighborhood. When I opened the door, the hall light buzzed overhead, casting a yellow halo around us. The older deputy introduced himself by name and offered a small nod of sympathy before he even asked a question. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Personal worry had turned into something larger, something official, and the weight of it settled into my bones. They stepped inside my apartment, their boots leaving faint prints on the thin carpet, and we sat at the kitchen table. I could still smell the coffee I had poured hours earlier, now cold in the pot. The younger deputy flipped open a notebook and asked for every detail: the time of her last message, the exact words she said, how she sounded, whether anything seemed off. He wrote slowly, the scratch of his pen loud in the quiet room. When he closed the notebook, he did so gently, as if afraid to disturb whatever thin layer of composure I had left. They told me rangers were already hiking toward the intended campsite, that a dog team was being prepped at the rim, and that by dawn a coordinated search would be underway. The older deputy touched the brim of his hat again. A quiet gesture meant to reassure, but it only deepened the sense that my life had just stepped into new territory, the kind outlined in official reports and late-night phone calls. I barely slept. The hours before dawn stretched out in a long, anxious quiet, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional buzz of a passing motorcycle on the road outside. I kept turning on lights, then turning them off, pacing between the window and the kitchen sink. Around 4 in the morning, when the air was still cool and the sky just beginning to pale, my phone rang. The sound sliced through the silence like a blade. It was Ranger Ruiz. He spoke calmly, but I could hear footsteps and voices behind him, the clipped, purposeful kind from people gearing up for a long day in rough country. He said the first team had reached the designated site. There was no sign of Lily or Cole. The tent wasn't there. Nothing looked disturbed. Nothing looked used. Just bare ground and the faint imprint of wind-blown dust. He told me quietly that I should come to Arizona. By midday, I was in Flagstaff, the scent of pine thick in the high desert air as I stepped out of the rental car. The ranger station stood low against the wide sky, its brown siding catching the harsh sunlight. Inside, the air was cooler, carrying the faint smell of old coffee and photocopier toner. A large topographical map was spread across a steel table, held down by radio's notepads and a half-empty bottle of water. Search coordinators leaned over it, tracing potential routes with blunt fingers, comparing notes, marking areas with green and orange grease pencil. I stood near the wall, hands clasped too tightly, listening to the rise and fall of their voices. They spoke in the calm, clipped tones of people who have done this before, not indifferent but practiced. A helicopter thumped to life outside its blades, chopping the air in short, insistent beats. I stepped out to watch it lift off the wind, pushing dust across the lot, making my eyes water. Volunteers were gathering 2 retired hikers, local college kids, a couple of seasoned climbers who knew the eastern backcountry like the lines of their palms. They moved with quiet efficiency, cinching straps on their packs, adjusting radios that crackled softly with static. Someone handed out orange bandanas for visibility. Someone else checked GPS units against paper maps. The smell of sweat, sunscreen, and diesel hung low in the warming air. By late afternoon, the search had stretched into miles of canyon edges and narrow side ravines. The first dog team followed a faint scent trail along a rocky incline before losing it at a patch of sun-baked stone where the heat had wiped away everything. A drone buzzed overhead, its small insect-like hum disappearing as it rose into the thermals. Rangers radioed back periodically short-coded updates about areas cleared and terrain too dangerous to traverse without ropes. Each call brought a brief flicker of hope, followed by a longer, heavier silence when nothing turned up. The next morning, I rode in the back seat of a ranger truck as we drove to the Wolf Creek trailhead. The tires crunched over gravel, kicking up a pale cloud that hung in the air behind us. When we arrived, I saw their car immediately, Cole's SUV sitting in the same place where rangers had found it the day before. Dust coated the windshield in a thin layer disturbed only by the arc of a hand someone had used to peer inside. The interior was neat. Gear bags in place, nothing missing, nothing out of order. And that normalcy was somehow more chilling than anything else. 2 trackers began studying the hardened dirt near the lot, crouching low, their fingertips brushing faint impressions in the earth. They pointed out what they believed were 2 sets of footprints leading toward the trail, one with a longer stride, one lighter. The prints were mostly intact, though wind had smeared the edges. One tracker paused at a spot a few yards from the path, tilting his head as if listening to something only he could hear. After a moment, he shook his head. Nothing definitive, he murmured, brushing off his palms. The further the teams went that day, the stranger the silence felt. No torn fabric, no dropped water bottle, no scraps of food packaging. Not even the kind of accidental mark hikers leave when they shift their packs or pause to catch their breath. It was as if they had walked into the canyon and simply never walked back out. Rumors started forming quietly the way dust gathers in corners. A couple at a nearby gas station whispered that the heat could make even experienced hikers misjudge their pace. A hotel clerk mentioned an old story about a shuttered mining cabin somewhere off-trail, the kind that attracted hermits and people who preferred to live unseen. One of the volunteers, a wiry man in his 60s with a sun-beaten face, muttered something about lights he once saw blinking on a distant ridge. Late-at-night flashes no one ever figured out. None of it helped, but all of it circled around the same truth. The canyon held pockets of darkness even locals didn't understand. Back at the command post, a small trailer set up near the trailhead, the air inside grew warm and stale as the afternoon sun climbed. Radios beeped in uneven intervals. Someone's walkie crackled with the faint sound of wind whipping through brush. A ranger scribbled new notes on the corner of a map, his handwriting getting sharper as fatigue set in. I sat in a folding chair, my fingers wrapped around a paper cup of lukewarm water. Every time the radio clicked, my heart jumped. Every time it went silent, the quiet felt heavier. Near sunset, I walked a short distance from the trailer, needing a breath of cooler air. The sky had turned a soft red, the color deepening along the canyon's distant edges. I could smell the faint sweetness of juniper drifting on the wind. In the distance, I heard a helicopter returning the rhythmic chop of its blades echoing off the cliffs. When it landed, searchers stepped out with slow, measured movements, not defeated, but worn. They spoke quietly to the incident commander, shaking their heads. One ranger approached me with an expression I couldn't read. He had dust on his boots and a map rolled under his arm. There was a brief hesitation before he spoke, that small pause people take when they're about to present something they don't know how to interpret yet. He said they hadn't found anything. Not a shred of the campsite, not a trace of gear, nothing that told them where Lily and Cole had spent their first night. Then he unrolled the map on the hood of a nearby truck. I stepped closer, feeling the warmth of the metal through my palms. There, in the fading light, he pointed to a narrow section of the ridge far east of the main trail, a place he said shouldn't have shown any recent activity. But it did. A faint cluster of fresh markings had been spotted on the rock near that ridge. Something out of place enough that the evening team planned to send a closer search at first light. He didn't say what it was, just that it wasn't natural, and it didn't fit with anything they had seen so far. He lifted his eyes toward the darkening horizon. The wind had picked up cool against our faces. Somewhere in the canyon below, night was sliding into the ravines, filling them one shadow at a time. The ranger rolled the map back up slowly, his fingers tightening just a bit on the edge of the paper. Whatever left that mark, he said quietly, it wasn't there last week. The weight of those words settled between us as the last of the daylight slipped away, and for the first time, I felt the cold certainty that we were on the edge of discovering something we weren't prepared to see. The morning the search shifted began like any other in that long blur of days, except the air felt different the moment I stepped out of the ranger station. A cool draft carried the scent of dust and juniper, and for the first time in a week, the sky held a thin gray curtain of clouds instead of the usual blistering blue. Search crews moved with that quiet, purposeful rhythm of people who had run out of small talk. Radios crackled with low voices, and the thump of the helicopter warming its blades cast a pulsing vibration across the gravel lot. I remember tightening my jacket against the wind when a sharp burst of static cut through the air, an urgent voice quick-clipped, asking for the incident commander. People stopped moving. Heads turned. Even the dog team paused mid-step. Something had been found. A minute later, the commander stepped out of the trailer, pressing a hand to his earpiece as he listened. I watched the muscles in his jaw tighten the way his eyes narrowed toward the east. He didn't say much, just enough to send a ripple through the group. A ranger grabbed his pack. Someone else jogged to the ATV with a med kit. And then the commander turned toward me, his boots crunching over the gravel. Before he spoke, I felt my stomach drop, as if my body knew what my mind refused to consider. He said they needed me at a site several miles off the main trail. There had been activity. Not remains, not yet. But something significant. The kind of something that stops a search in its tracks and forces a new direction. We rode in a convoy of trucks and ATVs, engines growling low as we moved along the dusty service road. The air smelled of warm rock and gasoline. As we got closer, the sky dulled to a pale gray, and a thin wind swept across the plateau, kicking fine powder into the air until it clung to our clothes like ash. When we reached the drop-off point, the lead ranger pointed toward a narrow crevice slicing through a wall of rock. From the opening drifted a faint, cool draft, the kind that comes from deep hidden spaces. We moved single file, our footsteps echoing softly between the stone walls. The temperature dropped as we descended, the air turning cooler, denser. Faint scuffs marked the path ahead. Heel prints dragged dirt, the telltale signs of recent movement. The ranger leading us slowed near a bend, raising his hand. His face was tight. He told me I should stay behind a line they'd set up ahead, but that I needed to see something with my own eyes. His voice was careful, steady, the way people speak when the truth is too heavy to carry alone. When we rounded the corner, the space opened into a small, hidden clearing wedged between high canyon walls. The ground was uneven, scattered with pebbles and bits of broken shale. A faint metallic tang hung in the air, mixing with the smell of old wood and dust. At the center of the clearing stood a weather-beaten structure. A cabin of sorts, long abandoned, its planks warped and faded from decades of sun and storms. The doorframe leaned to one side, and a curtain of torn cloth hung like a ragged mouth. The search team was gathered near the entrance, their faces set in that expression people wear when they're trying to steady themselves before speaking. A deputy approached with something wrapped in a clear evidence pouch. I could see his fingers trembling slightly where they touched the plastic. When he held it out, I recognized it instantly, though my mind tried to fight the recognition. The woven strap. The one from Lily's backpack. The same strap I had studied so many times in her photos. It was frayed along one edge, dusty but unmistakable. The sound around me dulled to a distant hum. I don't remember breathing. I don't remember speaking. I just stood there, the cold draft crawling up my spine as if the canyon itself were exhaling. They were careful with me, two rangers gently steering me back from the doorway, telling me I didn't need to step inside. But I did. I needed to see, even if every cell in my body told me not to. Inside, the air was cooler still, carrying the faint smell of old firewood and damp earth. Light filtered through the broken boards, cutting the dimness into strips of gold and shadow. On the floor lay remnants of a camp that hadn't belonged to Lily and Cole. Old tin cans, a rusted lantern, footprints of various sizes pressed into the dirt. Along the back wall, carved into the splintered boards, were shapes, crude, uneven circles with lines radiating out like eyes. Some were fresh, some older. A shiver ran down my arms. A ranger knelt near a bunk frame that had nearly collapsed under its own age. He reached under the boards and pulled out a small object wrapped in a plastic bag. It looked like a thin notebook, the edges scuffed, the cover worn. My breath caught in my throat. He didn't hand it directly to me, protocol wouldn't allow it, but he let me lean close enough to read the initials stamped on the front. C.M. Cole Mercer. My knees wobbled and I steadied myself against the wall. That was the moment the world shifted from fear into something far sharper. The unease that had followed me for days settled into a colder certainty. They hadn't just been lost. Someone had been here with them. Someone had taken them. Investigators moved quickly after that, sealing off the site and marking every inch of the clearing with numbered flags. Radios crackled with new orders, voices moving from calm to controlled urgency. They scanned the ground for fresh impressions, for signs of struggle, for any hint of direction. A tracker pointed to a section of the wall where a board had been recently pried loose. Behind it, tucked into a narrow gap, they found another piece of evidence, a folded map with lines drawn by hand, the ink smudged from rough handling. Roots. Arrows. Notes. A detective studied it for a long moment, his brow furrowed. He called the commander over, tapping a finger on a spot farther east. Their voices lowered, almost lost beneath the wind sweeping through the opening of the canyon. When they turned back to me, I saw something new in their faces. Not confusion, not hope. Something heavier, recognition, as if they'd stumbled across a signature they'd seen hints of before. That's when they told me about the stories. Unsolved disappearances in the region. Strange disturbances reported by hikers over the years. A handful of unexplained sites deep in the eastern canyon where few people ever ventured. Nothing they could prove, nothing they could pin down. But enough to suggest that Lily and Cole had not been the first to cross paths with whoever had marked these walls. The search widened within hours. Helicopters circled overhead, their shadows sliding across the stone like dark moving stains. Drones swept over ridges and ravines. Teams fanned out toward a place the map had labeled in rough handwriting, a remote section known informally among rangers as the Quarry. A place of old mines and forgotten trails. A place people avoided unless they had reason to go. They told me to stay back at the command post, but my feet wouldn't move. I stood there in the clearing listening to the restless wind, the rustle of unstable boards, the drone of distant engines. Grief and terror ran side by side inside me, neither fully registering, both too large to name. As night approached, the site glowed under bright portable lamps, casting long, eerie shadows across the canyon floor. Investigators worked quietly, their breath visible in the cooling air. My world had narrowed to a single point, the fact that Lily had been here. She had touched these walls. She had seen something that made her drop that strap. The cabin felt like a message, one etched in dust and fear. Before they drove me back to the base camp, a deputy stepped over with an evidence bag in his hands. He held it carefully, respectfully. Inside was a small scrap of fabric torn at one corner with a pattern I recognized. Lily had sewn that patch onto her hiking pants years ago, a little mountain silhouette, crooked but charming. My chest tightened and my legs felt weak again, but I nodded because I needed to. I needed them to keep going. When we reached the trucks, radios burst to life, a call from one of the eastern teams. They had found something else, something in a place miles beyond the cabin. The commander's eyes darkened and he told everyone to prepare for a long night. I felt the words before I heard them. A door had opened, and whatever was on the other side would not let us go back to the world we'd known just hours before. The hours after the second site was found moved in a blur, though certain details are carved into my memory with a clarity I didn't ask for. That stretch of canyon felt colder than it had any right to be, the air still and heavy as law enforcement sealed off the clearing and pushed deeper into the eastern ridges. I remember standing beside a ranger truck, the metal warm against my palm, when a radio burst to life with a sudden sharp urgency. Voices overlapped, the words clipped and breathless. Someone had reached the far site, the one marked on the hand-drawn map they pulled from Cole's notebook. They didn't tell me everything at once. They never do, and in hindsight I understand why. A detective approached with a slow, deliberate stride, his boots grinding softly against the gravel. The canyon wind picked up behind him, lifting dust in small spirals that danced and disappeared before touching the ground. He said they'd found a structure, something man-made tucked into a plateau that wasn't on any visitor map. His tone was steady, but there was a rawness behind it, like someone trying to speak through a weight pressing against their chest. They were bringing people out, he said. Not bodies. People. For a long moment I stared at him without fully understanding. My brain refused to process anything beyond that word, people. It wasn't until I heard a helicopter thudding overhead, banking hard toward the far ridge, that the meaning finally settled. Someone was alive. They flew me back toward the main staging area while rescue teams coordinated on the ground. The landing pad was a whirl of noise blades chopping the air, radios spitting commands, boots thudding across the packed dirt. I stood there with my heart pounding in my throat, the sun sinking behind the canyon walls as the helicopter descended through a haze of dust. When the skids touched down and the doors swung open, the world narrowed to a single figure on the stretcher. Lily. Her face was thinner, her skin sunburned and bruised, but her eyes were open. When they rolled her toward me, I saw her lift a hand ever so slightly, the trembling movement of someone who wasn't sure if they were dreaming. I walked beside her as the medics guided the stretcher away from the rotor wash, the sound of the blades rattling through my bones. When I leaned close enough, she recognized me. Her lips moved quietly, shaping a word that cracked something deep inside my chest. Sis. They didn't let us talk long. She was dehydrated, feverish, weak from 3 years of captivity and survival that I still struggle to comprehend. But she was alive. And in that moment, every fear I had carried through the canyon, every sleepless night and hollow morning, finally broke into something that felt like breath. Later, when the dust settled and another helicopter arrived with a second stretcher, I saw Cole for the first time since the day they vanished. He looked rougher than Lily, ribs-wrapped beard, overgrown eyes, wild with exhaustion, but he clutched her hand when they wheeled him past. Even through the chaos, their quiet connection was unmistakable. They'd survived together, held each other upright through something that would have destroyed most people. The man who took them was brought out last. He didn't arrive by stretcher. He arrived under heavy guard, shackled, silent eyes, hollow and unblinking. A former geologist, the Rangers later told me, a man who'd lived in the canyon's forgotten sections for years, letting its darkness become his entire world. Watching him step off that helicopter dirt, clinging to his clothes, I felt no satisfaction, no catharsis, just a deep, low grief for what he'd stolen from so many people. The days that followed were a swirl of statements, interviews, hospital corridors, and endless paperwork. Federal agents arrived with thick files and heavier expressions. They questioned Lily and Cole gently at first, then with more structure as the details of their captivity surfaced. The man had moved them between hidden sites, kept them isolated, convinced himself he was protecting the canyon from outsiders. Hearing the detectives put words to it, kidnapping, long-term captivity, serial pattern, felt surreal, like they were describing a nightmare I hadn't fully woken from. The trial took more than a year to begin. He refused to speak even to his own attorney. He sat in the courtroom like a statue carved from the same stone he'd lived among, unflinching as evidence piled up. When Lily took the stand, her voice was steady, though her hands tightened around the edges of the witness box. She described the barracks, the carved symbols, the way he watched them without blinking, as if he were part of the canyon itself. Cole spoke next, slower, his voice low and raspy from old injuries. When he recounted the day he was forced to leave Lily behind. He paused several times, staring at the floor as if the memory were a physical weight pressing down on him. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. 16 life sentences, no chance of parole. Justice, at least in its legal form, was done. But closure is never as clean as a verdict. In the years since Flagstaff has carried the story like a scar, a thin, pale line across the memory of the town. The coffee shop where Lily once worked still hangs one of her early canyon photos near the counter, its colors a little faded from sun. Mark, the owner, gives free coffee to search and rescue teams whenever they stop in. Ranger Ruiz retired not long after the case closed his gait slower, his eyes a little heavier. The canyon itself didn't change, but people who knew the story walk its edges with a different kind of respect, now a different kind of caution. As for Lily, healing has been its own journey. She moved back west for a time, staying with me until she felt steady enough to be on her own. Some mornings she'd wake before dawn, sitting at the kitchen table with a blanket over her shoulders, listening to the quiet, as if trying to remember how stillness was supposed to feel. Other days, she stayed outside for hours, sitting in the sun, her eyes tracing familiar patterns in the light. She never talks about the man unless she has to, but she does talk about the canyon, its beauty, its silence, the places that still make her feel whole. Cole eventually settled in Arizona again. He and Lily started leading safe, small group hikes along designated routes with clear boundaries and strict check-ins. They teach people how to respect the land, how to read weather, how to travel without assuming the wild belongs to them. Watching them together now, quieter, wiser, deeply connected, I understand something I didn't back then. Survival creates its own kind of bond. And me, I carry that canyon inside me in ways I never expected. Some days when the California afternoon light slants through my blinds just right, I see dust floating in the beam and feel a memory stir of helicopters, of radios, of the taut silence that filled the air right before they brought her home. I still wake up sometimes thinking I hear that faint tapping sound of a wind-blown sign against a post, the same sound from those long nights waiting for news. But life has a way of stitching itself back together, slowly, unevenly. The threads aren't always straight, but they hold. The last time I stood at the canyon rim with Lily beside me, the wind carried that familiar mix of rock pine and ancient dust. She lifted her camera not to chase a shot for a magazine, but simply to capture the light. Her hands were steady. The moment was quiet. And in that stillness, I felt something close to peace wash through me, thin but real, like the first warm breath after a long winter. Some truths stay with you no matter how much time passes. But so does the relief of seeing someone you love step back into the world one careful breath at a time. If you're still here with me, let me know where you're listening from and follow the channel so these stories are never forgotten.